You should know one thing before you hire me." The woman stood under the leaking roof of the Broken Spur stage ranch, rain running from the brim of her faded bonnet. "I am not the kind of woman men look at twice." Amos Hale studied her weathered face. Then he looked past her, at the gate hinge she had repaired without being asked, and the crooked account book she had already set straight. "Paint does not hold up a roof," he said. "Sound timber does. By spring, every person who had laughed at Ruth Bell would understand exactly what he meant." In the autumn of 1887, the Powder River country of Wyoming was preparing for an early winter. The grass had gone pale. Creeks were shrinking under thin skins of ice. Freight wagons hurried south before the high trails closed, and at the Broken Spur, Amos Hale was trying to run a ranch, a stage stop, and a horse relay station with 2 hired men, 1 bad shoulder, and a roof that leaked in 4 places. Amos was 61. He had crossed the plains as a boy, buried a wife at 47, and spent the years since then speaking more easily to horses than to people. He was respected from Buffalo to the dry forks of Crazy Woman Creek. He paid on time. He watered a stranger's team before his own. And when he gave his word, men stopped asking for paper. But respect did not make the kitchen less silent. It did not mend shirts. It did not put another cup beside his at supper. Ruth Bell arrived at the Broken Spur on foot, carrying a carpet bag with 1 broken clasp. She was 36, lean from hard travel with rough hands and a face made older by hunger, wind, and disappointment. A boarding house in town had dismissed her when the owner's married son began making excuses to enter her room. A laundry had refused her because customers wanted someone more pleasant to look at. At the general store, she had seen Amos's notice: "Housekeeper and bookkeeper need at Broken Spur. Winter wages, room and board. Must be reliable." The clerk had laughed when she asked for directions. "He is asking for reliable," the man said. "Not desperate." Ruth walked 12 miles anyway. By the time she reached the ranch, rain had soaked through her dress and 1 boot had split at the toe. Amos found her kneeling beside the porch, fastening a loose hinge with a bent horseshoe nail. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Keeping your gate from dropping. I did not tell you to." "No, sir." "Then why do it?" Ruth wiped rain from her cheek. "Because it needed doing." That answer made him ask her inside. The account book lay open on the table. Amos had never trusted columns of numbers. He trusted weight, weather, and the look in a horse's eye. Ruth studied the pages for less than 10 minutes. Then she pointed to 3 feed deliveries that had been charged twice. "You have paid the same invoice 6 times, she said. Amos stared at the page. "How much?" $42.80. That was nearly a month of wages. He asked if she could cook. She said enough to keep a man from starving. He asked if she could handle horses. She said she knew when to move slowly. He asked if she stole. Ruth looked him directly in the eye. "No." Then her courage seemed to leave all at once. "But you should understand, I am not pretty." Amos answered the way a man answers a question he considers unimportant. "Paint does not hold up a roof. Sound timber does." For the first time in years, Ruth had no reply. The next morning she rose before the lanterns were lit. She drew water, cleaned the stovepipe, stretched the last flour with cornmeal, and turned salt pork, onions, and beans into a supper that made both hired men stop talking. She found a split in the kitchen shelf and braced it with a scrap of pine. She boiled Amos's shirts, resewed the buttons, and left them folded near his bed without mentioning the holes. Then she went outside and stood beside a nervous gray mare that had kicked 2 men that week. Ruth did not grab the halter. She did not raise her voice. She rested 1 hand on the fence and waited. 10 minutes later, the mare stepped toward her. Amos watched from the barn doorway. "What did you do?" "Nothing. That horse does not trust nothing." Ruth kept her eyes on the mare. "She trusts people who do not need to prove they are stronger than she is." Amos remembered that sentence. Over the next 6 weeks, the Broken Spur changed. Not grandly. Not all at once. But the place began to hold together. The pantry was counted. The harness was oiled. The guest bunks were aired before travelers arrived. Ruth wrote every expense in a clean hand and discovered that a hay merchant in town had been shorting Amos by nearly 1 bale in 10. She stitched a canvas draft curtain across the back door. She mixed pine tar into a salve for a gelding's cracked hoof. At night she read aloud from an old newspaper while Amos repaired tack near the stove. Sometimes he answered her. Sometimes he only listened, but the silence in the room no longer felt empty. It felt shared. When they rode into town for winter supplies, people noticed. They noticed Ruth sitting beside Amos on the wagon bench. They noticed the new wool shawl he had purchased and pretended was part of her wages. And they noticed that Amos, who had once entered every store as if it were a chore, now waited for Ruth before leaving. At the general store, a woman named Mrs. Crandall glanced at Ruth's worn bonnet and smiled without kindness. "You could have found someone more decorative," she told Amos. The room went quiet. Amos set a sack of coffee on the counter. "Decoration is for a parlor." He looked toward Ruth. "I am building a life." Ruth turned away before anyone saw her eyes fill, but one man did see. Calder Hale, Amos's nephew, stood near the stove with his coat still buttoned. Calder had spent years assuming the broken spur would become his. He visited only when he needed money, but he spoke of the ranch as if it were already an inheritance. That evening he rode home with them. He watched Ruth check the supply list. He watched Amos hand her the payroll envelope to lock in the desk, and he watched the old man smile when Ruth scolded him for carrying a flour barrel with his bad shoulder. Calder's expression changed. Not much, just enough. 2 days later, the payroll money disappeared. The envelope was gone. The lock had not been broken. Only Amos and Ruth knew where the key was kept. One hired man stared at the floor. The other looked at Ruth's carpetbag. Calder leaned against the wall. "No one wants to say it," he murmured. "But strangers do not walk 12 miles in the rain because life has been kind to them." Ruth went pale. Amos stepped between them. "You will not speak to her that way in my house." Calder raised both hands. "I am only saying what any sensible man would ask." Amos did not ask it. That should have been enough. But Ruth had spent too many years watching suspicion enter a room before mercy did. That night she packed her carpetbag. Amos found her at the back door before dawn. Snow had begun to fall. "Where are you going?" "Town. The storm will close the road. I cannot stay where your own blood thinks I came to steal. My own blood has been wrong before." Ruth's mouth trembled. "And what happens the next time something goes missing? Or the next? I will spend every day proving I did not take what I never wanted." Amos reached for the bag. She pulled it back. "You gave me dignity. Do not make me beg for it." Then she walked into the snow. By noon the sky disappeared. The stage from Buffalo arrived carrying 3 passengers and a driver half frozen to his seat. Amos helped them inside. Calder saddled his horse, saying he intended to reach town before dark. As he tightened the cinch, the stable boy noticed a corner of red paper beneath Calder's saddle blanket. It was the missing payroll envelope. The boy called for Amos. Calder ran. He made it less than a mile, before the snow swallowed the trail and his horse threw him near a ravine. Amos found him alive, shaking and still clutching money he claimed had somehow ended up in his gear. There was no time for anger. A lantern had overturned in the hay barn. Flames climbed the dry wall. Horses screamed inside their stalls. The hired men fought the doors, but the wind drove smoke back into their faces. Amos wrapped a wet scarf over his mouth and went in. A beam fell across the aisle. He went down beneath it. Then someone came through the smoke from the far end of the barn. Ruth. She had made it 3 miles toward town before hearing the ranch bell ringing through the storm. She turned back. Not because the ranch had been fair to her. Not because the town had been kind. She turned back because frightened animals were trapped and Amos was inside. Ruth cut 2 lead ropes, opened the side gate, drove the gray mare toward daylight. Then she crawled under the burning beam and found Amos pinned by the shoulder. He tried to push her away. "Roof is coming down." "So is your pride," she coughed. "Move." With one of the iron stall bars as a lever, she lifted the beam enough for him to drag free. They stumbled into the snow as the center of the barn collapsed behind them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Amos lay on his back, breath smoking in the dark. Ruth knelt beside him, one sleeve burned, both hands bleeding. Calder stood near the fence, unable to meet her eyes. The stable boy held up the red envelope. The money was under his saddle. Ruth looked at Amos. He did not say. I knew. He did not make the moment about being right. He only took her injured hands in his. "I am sorry you had to keep proving what I should have protected." That was the first time Ruth saw tears in Amos Hale's eyes. Winter settled hard over the Powder River country. The hay barn was gone. Half the stored feed was ruined. Amos's shoulder took weeks to heal. But the horses lived, the travelers lived, and Ruth stayed. Not because Amos asked her as an employer. He never did that again. He asked her to sit beside the stove while the storm buried the porch steps. He placed the old payroll key on the table between them. "I thought I was hiring a woman who could keep books," he said. Ruth waited. "I thought a house only needed work." He looked around the room, at the mended curtain, at the bread cooling by the stove, at the second cup beside his. Turns out a house can stand for years and still not be a home. Ruth lowered her eyes. Amos continued. The first day you came here, I told you paint did not hold up a roof. I remember. I knew you were sound timber. He took a breath. What I did not know was that I was the one leaning on you. Ruth began to cry. Not the helpless tears she had shed when people judged her. These were different. These came from being seen. In March, neighbors arrived with axes, wagons, and fresh-cut pine. The same town that had once watched Ruth with suspicion now followed her measurements as she marked the frame for the new barn. Mrs. Crandall brought coffee. The feed merchant returned every dollar he had overcharged. Even Calder came once, hat in hand, to apologize. Ruth listened, then she told him forgiveness did not mean trust returned in a day. Amos said nothing. He only smiled, because the answer sounded like her. By May, the broken spur had a stronger barn, a repaired roof, and a new sign over the porch. Ruth and Amos Hale stage relay, and boarding. Ruth stared at the carved letters. You forgot to ask me something. Amos removed his hat. No, Mom. He took a plain silver ring from his coat pocket. I was waiting until I had a roof worthy of the answer. Ruth laughed through her tears. I am still not pretty. Amos looked at her exactly as he had on the first day. Only now his voice was warmer. Ruth, paint fades. He slipped the ring onto her hand. Sound timber holds.